Prince William had just revealed something about Camilla's daughter that the palace had no intention of ever making public, and the moment his evidence reached the king's desk, Charles had no choice but to demand answers. What appeared on the surface to be a quiet family disagreement about personal property was, in reality, something far more deliberate and far more damaging than anyone inside the institution had been prepared to admit. A secret operation had been running inside the royal circle for years, carefully constructed, quietly executed, and aimed at something that William considered untouchable. It had been aimed directly at erasing Diana's memory from history. And the person at the center of it was someone most people had never thought to watch. Before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a royal investigation like this one. The deeper this story goes, the more complicated it becomes. But to understand exactly what William found and why it forced him to make the most aggressive institutional move of his life, we need to go back to a single morning in May, when a photograph arrived that changed everything. It started with a photograph, not a leaked document, not a whistleblower, not a source inside the palace with something to prove. Just a photograph, the kind that gets attached to a pre-auction catalog, circulated quietly among a small number of private clients and never intended to travel any further than that. But it did travel further. It reached someone it was never supposed to reach. And the moment it did, everything inside Kensington Palace changed. That morning, William's entire international schedule was cancelled. No explanation was offered publicly. No press statement was issued. No spokesperson appeared with carefully chosen language about logistical adjustments or scheduling conflicts. Kensington Palace simply went silent, and people who work closely with the royal household will tell you that that particular kind of silence is not neutral. It means something has happened that cannot yet be spoken about. It means the institution is moving. Inside the palace, advisors were summoned, doors were closed, phones were silenced. Those present described an atmosphere that felt less like a royal residence and more like a room where a verdict had just been delivered and nobody was quite ready to say it aloud yet. What William had seen in that photograph were two pieces of jewelry, a black diamond pendant on a fine chain, a sapphire bracelet of considerable intricacy. To anyone without context, they might have appeared to be elegant vintage pieces, the kind of items that pass through auction houses regularly, catalogued under a civilian name, priced appropriately, and sold without ceremony. But William had context. He had seen these pieces before, not in a catalog, not in a museum archive, not in a formal royal inventory. He had seen them on his mother. These were Diana's, not pieces loosely associated with her, not items that had passed through royal hands in some general sense. These were specific, documented, personally significant pieces that Princess Diana had worn publicly in the late 1980s, pieces that William, as a teenager, had confronted Camilla about directly in the year 2000, after becoming aware that they had moved in a direction he did not understand and could not accept. That confrontation had ended with assurances. The pieces would be secured, they would be locked away, they would not resurface. They had been locked away for over 26 years, and now they were sitting inside Sotheby's, logged under Laura Lopes's name, waiting to be catalogued. The shock William felt in that moment was not simply personal, it was institutional. Because whoever had brought those pieces to Sotheby's had not done so carelessly. The process was structured, the documentation was deliberate. And the implications once his legal team began to examine them were far larger than two missing pieces of jewelry. What William did not yet know was that those two pieces were the only part of the operation that had gone wrong. Everything else had already worked exactly as planned. Before we go any further into the legal machinery and the institutional responses and the court orders, we need to stop. Because none of what William did next makes complete sense unless you understand what those two pieces of jewelry actually represented to him. And it was not what most people would assume. This was not about financial value. It was not about royal protocol or procedural correctness or the technical classification of crown property. Those things would matter later, in courtrooms and legal filings and formal correspondence between palace lawyers. But in the moment, William saw that photograph in the seconds before any of that machinery began to move. What he was looking at was his mother. Diana wore the black diamond pendant during a period when her marriage was already fracturing in ways the public had not yet been permitted to see. The sapphire bracelet appeared in photographs from engagements she attended alone, carrying herself with the particular kind of composure that people who are privately exhausted learn to perform in public. William was a child during those years, but children remember what adults wear when they are trying to hold themselves together. He remembered these pieces, not as artifacts, as memories. When he confronted Camilla about them in the year 2000, he was not yet the composed, strategically precise figure he would become. He was a teenager who had lost his mother 3 years earlier and had just discovered that certain things belonging to her had moved in directions nobody had explained to him. The conversation, by all accounts, was brief. The assurances were clear. The pieces would be locked away. That chapter was closed. He had believed it was closed. What the Sotheby's photograph told him quietly, without drama, in the language of a pre-auction catalog, was that it had never been closed at all. That while he had been grieving and growing and learning to carry his mother's legacy with the dignity the institution expected of him, something else had been happening entirely. And the person whose name appeared on the catalog documentation was Camilla's daughter. That detail did not land as a political complication, it landed as a betrayal. Which is why what followed was not negotiation. William did not make phone calls to Clarence House. He did not request a family meeting. He did not send a carefully worded note through the usual channels asking for an explanation. Those were the responses of someone who believed the situation could still be managed quietly between people who fundamentally respected one another. William had stopped believing that the moment he saw the photograph. Instead, he called his legal team. And what none of them inside Clarence House yet understood was that this was not the beginning of the conflict. By the time that photograph arrived, William had already been moving quietly, methodically, and with considerable legal force for weeks. Several weeks before the photograph arrived, William had made a decision that most people inside the palace dismissed as an administrative matter. In May, he authorized the liquidation of 20% of the Duchy of Cornwall's commercial real estate portfolio. The figures involved were significant £500 million withdrawn from active markets in a single coordinated movement. The official explanation, released through the appropriate channels with the appropriate language, described the action as a reallocation toward local housing initiatives and community reinvestment. It was the kind of announcement that generates a brief news cycle, receives measured approval from the right commentators, and then disappears from public conversation within days. That was precisely the intention. Because the housing initiatives were real, the community reinvestment was real, but they were not the reason. What William had actually done, and what his advisors understood immediately, even if they said nothing publicly, was target a financial network. A specific, long-standing, carefully constructed network of private trusts and civilian funds that had been operating inside the gray areas of the royal estate system for more than 2 decades. These were not illegal structures in any simple sense. They existed in the ambiguous space between institutional finance and private arrangement, the kind of space that large, complex organizations accumulate over generations without anyone ever being required to examine them too directly. What they had been doing, consistently and quietly, was channeling wealth in directions that benefited Camilla's household and her extended circle, not the direct line of succession, not the institutional priorities of the monarchy as a working constitutional body, but the private interests of a parallel household that had grown, over the years, increasingly comfortable with the financial arrangements it had inherited. William's advisors warned him explicitly before he signed the authorization. The king would see this as a provocation. Camilla's household would interpret it as an attack, because that is exactly what it was. There would be serious disruption. There would be consequences that could not be easily contained. William's response left no room for discussion. The duchy's resources, he said, existed to serve the people and the institution, not private interests. Not peripheral networks, not arrangements that had simply persisted because nobody had chosen to examine them. He signed the authorization, no negotiation, no compromise, No warning issued to Clarence House before the movement was executed. What nobody at Clarence House yet understood was that this financial decision had not been made in isolation. It had been made as preparation, a deliberate restructuring of the financial landscape before a second action, far more direct and far more personal, was set in motion. The duchy decision had cleared the ground. The photograph from Sotheby's was what William had been waiting to find, and once he found it, the ground was already clear. The meeting at Sandringham was not announced. There was no entry on the official calendar, no advance notice issued to the press office, no coordinated statement prepared for afterward. William arrived without the kind of accompanying apparatus that usually surrounds a formal royal engagement, no large delegation, no visible ceremonial purpose. Just William, his closest legal advisor, and a leather binder that he carried himself. Charles received him. What happened inside that room has never been officially confirmed. The palace has not spoken about it. Neither man has addressed it publicly. But the document William placed on the table that afternoon has since been examined by constitutional and legal analysts with sufficient access to understand its implications, and those implications were not subtle. It was a letters patent for asset reclassification, a constitutional instrument that most people inside the institution had hoped would never need to be invoked in a context like this one. In practical terms, it established a legal framework through which the heir apparent could petition the Privy Council directly bypassing the sovereign's household entirely in circumstances where the reigning monarch could not adequately protect crown historical property due to a compromised capacity to, in number said, govern. The phrase compromised capacity to govern was the weight-bearing clause, and both men in that room understood exactly what it referred to. Charles has been managing a cancer diagnosis that the palace has handled with characteristic restraint-controlled disclosure, careful public appearances, language designed to project continuity rather than concern. Privately, those closest to the institution have known for some time that the king's ability to maintain the full executive function of his role is not what it was. William knew it. The legal document on the table acknowledged it not cruelly, not dramatically, but with the precise, impersonal language of constitutional law, which is perhaps more devastating than cruelty precisely because it contains no emotion at all. William did not raise his voice. He did not make threats in the theatrical sense. He explained what the document was. He explained what it would mean if he were required to present it to the Privy Council, and then he gave his father a choice. Sign the decree formally reclassifying Diana's jewelry as crown property, held exclusively for the direct line of succession, bypassing Camilla's household entirely. Or William would escalate, and the question of the king's executive capacity would become a matter of constitutional record. Charles looked at the document for a long time, then he signed it, one signature. And with it, something shifted inside the institution that no public statement could undo because what Charles had done in that moment was not simply protect Diana's jewelry. He had acknowledged, in the only language the monarchy truly recognizes, that his son now held the authority. What happened the following morning moved faster than anyone inside Clarence House had anticipated. The decree Charles signed at Sandringham did not sit quietly on a desk somewhere inside the palace waiting to be processed through the usual administrative channels. William's legal team had been prepared before the meeting took place. The moment the signature was confirmed, they moved. Farrer and Company, the firm that has handled the Crown's most sensitive legal matters for generations, the kind of institution that operates entirely without public profile precisely because the work it does cannot afford one, filed the paperwork with the High Court before the end of that same day. What they filed was a Mareva injunction. For those unfamiliar with the instrument, it is worth understanding what it actually does, because it is not a polite legal request. It is not a formal letter of concern or a preliminary inquiry inviting a response. A Mareva injunction is one of the most aggressive financial tools available under British law. It freezes everything, every account, every investment portfolio, every trust fund, every financial structure associated with the named individual frozen, simultaneously, without warning, the moment the court approves the order. The court approved it. Within minutes, Alerts had been dispatched to Coutts, to Barclays, and to every major financial institution holding accounts connected to Laura Lopes. Her entire financial life, every account she could access, every asset she could liquidate, every fund she could draw from stopped. Completely. She could not move money. She could not transfer holdings. She could not make arrangements of any kind. She was, in the precise legal sense of the word, paralyzed, and that was only the first part of what happened that day. At 5:30 the following morning, before most of the household would have been awake, before the press had any indication that anything was occurring, before Clarence House had been given any opportunity to prepare a response, officers arrived at Laura's estate in Wiltshire. They carried a ministerial-level search warrant. This was not a courtesy visit. This was a high court enforcement order, and it was executed with the efficiency of an operation that had been planned well in advance of the morning it was carried out. They found what they were looking for: the black diamond pendant, the sapphire bracelet. Both pieces located, both pieces formally documented, both pieces seized under the reclassification decree that Charles had signed at Sandringham. By the time the sun had fully risen over Wiltshire, Diana's jewelry had been officially returned to Crown classification, held exclusively for the direct line of succession, beyond the reach of any parallel household claim. From the outside, it had taken less than 48 hours. From the inside, it had taken weeks of preparation, one constitutional ultimatum, and a signature from a king who understood that refusing was no longer a viable option. But as the officers left Wiltshire that morning, a classified document inside the Ministry of Justice contained information that nobody had yet examined closely enough. 2 pieces had been recovered. The repository had held 14. The High Court audit was ordered on the 14th of June. It was presented, officially, as a procedural step, a standard inventory review following the reclassification of Crown property. The kind of administrative process that generates paperwork and legal correspondence, but rarely produces anything that changes the fundamental shape of a story. Those inside William's legal team knew better. The audit had not been ordered because anyone expected it to confirm what they already knew. It had been ordered because William's advisors suspected that what they already knew was only a fraction of what had actually happened. They were right. The Highgrove repository had held 14 documented artifacts connected to Diana's personal collection. 2 had been recovered in Wiltshire. The audit established, with the cold precision of forensic accounting, that the remaining 12 were not simply missing from their designated location. They had been moved. Deliberately, carefully, and most significantly moved out of the country. Forensic tracking data embedded in the audit pointed to a private holding company. Anonymous registration, no public profile. Incorporated in the state of Delaware. In the United States, a jurisdiction specifically chosen, those familiar with international asset law will recognize immediately because it sits entirely outside the reach of British High Court enforcement. The injunction that had frozen Laura Lopes's accounts, the decree that Charles had signed at Sandringham, the reclassification order that had returned the 2 recovered pieces to Crown documentation, none of it could touch what was sitting inside a Delaware holding company. The British legal system, for all its considerable force, stops at the border. And then came the detail that reframed everything. Inside the classified Ministry of Justice file that surfaced in the weeks following the audit, a coded reference appeared in the forensic paper trail. The name used was not a legal name, it was a location. The Montecito Connection. 2 words that, to anyone who had followed the extended royal family through its most turbulent recent chapter, pointed in one direction without needing to be more specific than that. Someone who had left the United Kingdom permanently. Someone with the resources, the international connections, and the established legal infrastructure to move valuable items through private channels without triggering the kind of attention that would reach palace walls. Someone who had spent years navigating their own complicated relationship with the institution and who would understand, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what Diana's personal collection represented as leverage. This was the moment the story changed shape entirely. Because Laura Lopes had not acted spontaneously, she had not made an impulsive decision to bring 2 pieces of jewelry to Sotheby's on a quiet afternoon in May. She had been careless with 2 pieces from an operation that had already successfully moved 12 others beyond legal recovery. The part of the plan that worked had already worked. What William had uncovered was not the whole operation, it was the mistake. Camilla learned about the asset freeze on Laura's accounts the way powerful people inside the palace usually learn about things they were never supposed to find out through a lawyer, in a phone call, with language carefully chosen to communicate the severity of the situation without allowing any space for denial. She called in her legal team immediately. The first question she asked was the obvious one. The one anyone in her position, with her history inside this institution, with her 2 decades of accumulated understanding of how the monarchy protects its own, the one she would have asked before any other. Could sovereign immunity be applied? Could the constitutional protections that attach to the reigning monarch, and in specific circumstances to the Queen Consort during the execution of official duties, be extended to cover what was happening to her daughter? Her lawyers answered without softening it. No. Sovereign immunity is a precise instrument. It applies to the reigning monarch. It applies, in carefully defined circumstances, to the Queen Consort acting in an official capacity. It does not extend to private citizens. And Laura Lopes, under the legal framework that William's team had constructed with considerable care over several weeks, was no longer being treated as a protected member of the royal household. She had been reclassified deliberately, legally, and without any procedural error that could be challenged as a civilian holding crown property without authorization. The constitutional protections that Camilla had spent a lifetime learning to navigate did not reach her daughter, not here, not in this, so Camilla could not protect Laura legally. What she could attempt, what she had always been extraordinarily effective at, was controlling the narrative. For 2 decades, that had been her most reliable instrument. Longer than any legal tool, more durable than any institutional arrangement, the ability to shape what the public believed about her had been the foundation on which she had rebuilt her entire position inside the monarchy. She had transformed herself, through patience and precision and an acute understanding of how the British press operates, from the woman the public blamed for the collapse of a beloved marriage into someone who seemed indispensable to the institution itself. That transformation had not happened by accident. It had been managed carefully, one favorable story at a time. But William had anticipated this with the same methodical precision he had applied to every other element of the operation. A total communications blackout was already in place. The Buckingham Palace press office had been restricted no statements, no background briefings, no carefully sourced conversations with sympathetic journalists without direct authorization from Kensington Palace. High Court confidentiality orders had been secured, preventing major financial and news outlets from publicly connecting the banking freezes to the royal collection. Camilla found herself, for the first time in 20 years, completely without a voice. The woman who had mastered the machinery of palace narrative management was legally silenced, and inside Clarence House, there was nothing left to do but wait and watch William's next move land without any way to absorb it. The statement from Kensington Palace was short. That was the first thing people noticed. In a media environment that had spent weeks sensing that something significant was happening inside the royal institution, tracking unusual banking freezes, monitoring the sudden silence from Clarence House, noting the absence of the routine press engagements and background conversations that usually keep the palace narrative moving, many had expected something substantial, a formal address, a detailed account, the kind of carefully constructed public communication that signals an institution defending itself against a serious challenge. What they received instead was 3 sentences. William said that his mother's legacy was not a commodity to be bargained over or to have its history quietly obscured. He said that a boundary had been set, and then he stopped. No elaboration. No named individuals. No direct reference to Laura Lopes, to the Sotheby's catalog, to the Wiltshire estate, to the High Court injunction, to the meeting at Sandringham, to the leather binder, to the letters patent, to the Delaware Holding Company, to the Montecito connection. None of it. Just 3 sentences, released through the official Kensington Palace channel, carrying the weight of everything that had happened in the preceding weeks without acknowledging a single detail of it publicly. It was, those who study the mechanics of royal communication will tell you, a masterclass in institutional messaging, because the statement did not need to explain itself. The people who needed to understand it already understood it completely. Camilla understood it. Laura Lopes's legal team understood it. The advisors inside Clarence House, who had spent days in frantic internal discussions, understood it. The High Court had already done the explaining. William's statement was not information. It was a declaration. Simultaneously, the Diana Heritage Trust was formally announced. This was the structural permanence behind the statement, the legal architecture that ensured the boundary William had described could never be quietly dismantled after the immediate attention faded. Every piece of jewelry and every personal artifact belonging to Diana was now locked inside a trust with what his legal team described as ironclad terms. Not held loosely within the broader royal estate system where administrative arrangements could shift over time. Not subject to the discretion of the sovereign's household. Locked, designated exclusively for Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and in time for Princess Charlotte. Bypassing entirely any claim, access, or influence from any parallel household, including, without needing to name it, the household at Clarence House. International financial outlets that had been tracking the unusual capital movements for weeks, Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, others had been prevented by the confidentiality orders from connecting what they had observed to the royal collection. But royal correspondents and constitutional analysts, parsing William's statement and the simultaneous trust announcement with the careful attention their profession demands, understood the full outline of what had occurred even without the specific details they were not permitted to report. The public conversation that followed was quieter than the story deserved, deliberately so. But inside the institution, everyone knew William had won, completely, quietly, and in a manner that left no mechanism for appeal. What remained unresolved, the 12 missing pieces, the Delaware Holding Company, the coded name in the Ministry of Justice file, had not disappeared. It had simply been set aside, for now. The invitation had been on the calendar for months. A summer garden party at Buckingham Palace, one of the institution's most established seasonal rituals, attended by several hundred guests, photographed extensively, and designed to project exactly the image the monarchy has always relied upon in difficult periods: continuity, stability. The composed, unhurried face of an institution that does not panic, does not fracture, and does not allow private turbulence to disturb the surface it presents to the world. Nobody mentioned what had happened in the preceding weeks, not publicly, not in any official capacity. The guest list was announced through the appropriate channels. The dress code was observed. The weather held. And the royal family appeared, as they always appear at these occasions, with the particular kind of practiced composure that takes generations to cultivate. But those who attend these events with professional attention, the royal correspondents, the photographers who have spent careers learning to read what the institution communicates through positioning and proximity, and the precise geometry of who stands where, were watching something else entirely. Charles and William arrived in the same space and moved through it with a quality of interaction that was difficult to define precisely and impossible to misread entirely. There was no visible tension in the theatrical sense. No cold shoulders, no averted gazes, no moments that a camera could isolate and caption as evidence of open conflict. The British monarchy does not offer those moments at garden parties. What it offers instead is something subtler and in many ways more revealing the specific texture of two people who have recently renegotiated the terms of their relationship, performing normality with slightly more deliberateness than normality actually requires. Camilla was present. She moved through the afternoon with the discipline of someone who has spent 2 decades learning that public composure is not optional, that the garden party, the church service, the state banquet, the arrival on the steps, these are not social occasions in any ordinary sense. They are performances in the oldest institutional tradition, and the performance must be maintained regardless of what is happening offstage. But something had shifted in the geometry of how she occupied the space. Those who study the visual language of these occasions, the walking order, the positioning in photographs, the subtle choreography of who stands beside whom and who stands slightly behind, noted that Camilla's placement that afternoon was different from what it had been at comparable events in recent years. Not dramatically, not in any way that a casual observer would register or a headline could accurately describe, just slightly, just enough. Laura Lopes was not there. No explanation was offered for her absence. None was necessary. The institution had already communicated everything it needed to communicate through legal documents and court orders and a 3-sentence statement from Kensington Palace. The garden party said the rest, not in words. In distance. In positioning. In the quiet, unspoken language of an institution that had just reorganized itself and wanted those paying close enough attention to understand exactly how, Laura Lopes signed the legal agreement without a trial. There was no dramatic courtroom proceeding, no public testimony, no formal sentencing or official finding of guilt entered into the public record. Just a document negotiated between legal teams, signed quietly, and filed with the High Court in the manner of an administrative conclusion rather than a dramatic reckoning. She relinquished all claim to the 2 recovered pieces. In exchange, partial access to her frozen accounts was restored enough to cover administrative costs, enough to allow ordinary life to resume in its most basic functions. Nothing more. The financial infrastructure that had been locked down remained largely restricted. The operation she had been part of, whatever its full dimensions, whoever had coordinated it at the level above her was never publicly named in the agreement. She signed. And then she disappeared from the story, which is perhaps the most telling detail of all, because the people who disappear quietly from stories like this are rarely the ones who designed them. Step back now and look at what this episode actually produced, not the legal outcomes, not the press statements, not the formal institutional announcements, but the permanent changes that nobody is officially acknowledging. William entered this period as the heir apparent. He leaves it as something more difficult to define within the traditional language of royal succession, a figure who has demonstrated, through action rather than title, that the real executive authority of the institution has already begun its transfer. He did not wait for a crown. He used the legal framework available to him, applied it without hesitation, and established a precedent that cannot be quietly undone by any future administrative arrangement. Charles remains the reigning monarch. His title is intact. His public schedule continues. But he signed a document at Sandringham that acknowledged, in the only language the institution truly recognizes, that his capacity to protect what matters most had become dependent on his son's willingness to let him do so. That is not a small thing to carry. And the weight of it does not diminish simply because no official statement describes it. Camilla retains her title. She retains her position. She retains the public image she spent 20 years constructing with extraordinary patience and considerable skill. What she no longer retains is the mechanism that made all of it feel secure, the ability to shape the narrative, to manage the press, to move quietly through the institutional landscape without anyone possessing the legal authority to stop her. And the 12 missing pieces remain wherever they are, in a private holding company in Delaware, connected to a name that appears in a classified file most people will never read, sitting beyond the reach of British law, waiting. Diana's jewelry represents something that cannot be appraised in any auction catalog, a direct, physical, irreplaceable connection to a woman the world has never stopped mourning. William secured what he could reach. The rest is still out there, and whoever holds it understands exactly what it is worth, not in pounds, but in everything that pounds cannot buy.